Hey everybody, welcome to Second Pass, the place where Pastor Nick, me, actually finishes his sermon. So this last Sunday I was talking about communion in Mark 14 and how communion is a ritual that we do that's ordained by Jesus. He commanded us to do it just like baptism. And and two of the really important parts of it is that it's a ritual of confession and a ritual of remembrance. And I spent most of my time in my sermon talking about the importance of confession, that you actually have to take this truth that you believe and you need to say it with your mouth and you need to act it out with your body through ritual, because we tend to become the thing that we imitate. And you really can say something that you believe mentally until you start believing it in your heart. There's a process of making what you cognitively think become your emotional reaction and therefore your default behavior. And that's a process of confessing and acting things out until they become part of you on a deeper emotional level. So confession and profession and proclamation are all really important parts of how we form our inner lives spiritually to follow Jesus like we want to, and we know we should. But the other part of the equation is remembrance. When Jesus offered this thing called communion, he said one of the reasons, in fact the main reason he gave for us to do it, was he said, "Do this in remembrance of me." And it's not really a poor buddy dying and he says, "Remember me because I don't want to be forgotten." That's not the point. Memory or the remembrance of something God is doing is really important throughout the whole Bible. In fact, in the Torah, when God gives his people the laws and the commandments, there's this constant theme of memory. Remember this. Remember this day. Remember this event that happened. Remember how, and most of them have to do with remembering something God did for you. So one of the big ones is the Passover. That before God even did the Passover, the action in Egypt, he gave them the ritual as the event. So they had to do the Passover ritual for the event God did for them to even happen, so that the ritual of remembrance and the event would be forever bound together. And so that as time went on, the ritual would always stand for the event itself, so that the people would never forget that it was God that saved them. It was God that delivered them from slavery in Egypt. It was God that brought them through the Red Sea. It was God that fed them in the desert. It was God that saved them from the people they would end up fighting. And it was God that gave them the new promised land. And as long as the people remembered that God was taking them out of something horrible, bringing them to something good through the means he chose, and he was the one doing the work, the people would be able to be faithful. But if they forgot, then they wouldn't be. Now, it's important, I think, to think a little bit for a minute on just memory in general. For example, who lost in the Super Bowl 2 years ago? Just 2 years ago, who lost in the Super Bowl? Most important football game of the year? Yeah, that's what I thought. Or, what did you have for breakfast 4 days ago? Or here's another one. How do you find the circumference of a circle? What's the equation for that? You learned it in school. It was easy math. How do you find the circumference of a circle? Or, what's your parents' anniversary? Or if you know that, what about your grandparents' anniversary? I mean, those are different things in different parts of our lives, but, any one of those you could not remember. And any one of those would be thought to be something people would remember. But we don't. We don't really remember all that much. We tend to remember the things that our brain thinks we're going to need. And we forget what we don't need. And one of the things that's also true is, as we progress into the digital age of computers and iPads and phones and all the kinds of things that connect us to information and that hold information, memory isn't nearly as important. Being able to connect pieces of information, being able to do things with them once you've got them, are all important. But having the information in your mind isn't considered as important at all because you can just access it, right? And one of the things you see this is when I tell somebody, every Bible teacher in Jesus' time, all the Pharisees and Sadducees, for the most part, had the whole Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, and usually some more, word for word memorized. Like, literally, word for word memorized. Now, these days, that just doesn't compute. I mean, we have a hard time, like, revving ourselves up to memorize one Bible verse, Because we don't think of memorization and the deliberate working of memory to be that big a deal. But in the ancient world, they didn't have digital stuff. Memory was foundational to how information got passed on and got accessed. There weren't a lot of books. There was more information in people's heads than there was available in through any other means. And when you realize that, you begin to realize that you can only live out in a present action based on something you have already in your head. You can't remember something you don't know. And if what you remember, what God has already done for you, is supposed to frame your present, then anything that is supposed to frame your present and your future, you've got to have not just somewhere in there. It's got to be right here. It's got to be accessible. It's got to be front and center. It's got to be a framed set of memories that you are intentionally holding in place to view your life through. And that's one of the reasons why God has given us the rituals He's given us and given us the scriptures He's given us, is because if you don't coach your memory, if you don't actively form your own memory, then it radically hurts your ability to believe in and love and follow Jesus in the present. Because you're not going to just naturally remember the kinds of things that are critical spiritually. That's just not how our minds work. When you think about the original Passover that God said was supposed to be used as an aid to memory, right? What were they supposed to remember? Well, every Passover meal was supposed to have bitter herbs or some kind of plant that doesn't taste very good, and unleavened bread. And the unleavened bread is called by God the, quote, bread of affliction. That is, that the bitter herbs and the unleavened bread was life as it shouldn't be. Bread's good, but unleavened bread isn't very good. And, there's a lot of plants that taste good, but not bitter herbs, right? And so the whole idea was, part of every Passover meal, which was a great feast, was something you were going to eat that wasn't very good. And the whole point of that was to remember that God saved us out of something, right? There was a time when we were in affliction, and that affliction was terrible. And it's very easy to forget that. So that in the book of Numbers, after the people had come out of the promised land, they were remembering Egypt, but the things they remembered were the good things. Why? Because they were presently in a hardship. They were in the desert. And so they remembered the things that were different than the hardship. So they were eating food they didn't particularly like. So they remembered every time they ate good food in the past. They were in a place that was uncomfortable. So they thought back about the comforts that they had when they did have them. They didn't like that there wasn't any meat out in the desert. And they remembered that every once in a while they had fish in Egypt. And so because of their difficult present circumstance, they looked back to when they weren't in difficulty, and they remembered that, and they thought about how bad God must be. Rather than looking back and remembering that they had been in slavery, and God saved them from that. And that though things were hard now, if God saved them out of that slavery, He might still be working for their salvation towards the future, and you can hang in there. These people were supposed to remember what they felt like. One of the things God said they had to do was to have their staff in their hand, their robe tucked into their belt, and shoes on their feet. 3 things people would never do at a meal. And the whole reason was, He wanted them to remember that God acted and they were free. And they were ready to go. And they wanted to be free. And they left. And the whole idea was to help them realize that they'd never want to go back. Just like the same thing's true for us as Christians. I mean, if we've really come out of something, if we really know that God has saved us from a life of sin, death, hell, and the world, and if we really believe Jesus has saved us into something new and better, and if we remember, like if that's lodged in our memory, and we keep remembering what God has brought us out of, what God has brought us into, how he's going to ultimately save. If we remember all these things, then our memory will be framed in such a way that when we go through hardships, we don't want to go back because we remember how bad it was. We want to keep going forward. But that kind of faith can only come from real remembrance. Let me give you one quick example of this and then I'll be done. A few nights ago, my intern, Adam, went out with some friends and he came back at like 6:11 in the morning. He went to bed 3 minutes before my kids got up, And, he didn't do anything bad. He just went out with some Christian friends. They just had a good time for a long time. And we were picking on him about it the next day, and Alexi said, my wife, don't pay attention to us. We're just jealous that we can't do that anymore. Which is, that's partly true. You get in my life stage. I'm married. I have 3 kids. I think back about the days when I could go to sleep when I wanted, wake up when I wanted, didn't have a lot of responsibility. It's true. There are some things I miss about that. But one of the things to think about, I think, is what do I remember from my single days? Because there's 2 totally different sets of things that I could remember, right? Like, I was lonely when I was single. There's a lot of times when I was with friends and doing fun stuff, and there were a lot of times when I wasn't lonely at all. But I didn't have a close companion like my wife. I didn't have somebody who was in my bed, who I woke up next to, who had walked with me for years. When I was single, there wasn't really anybody in the world who really knew me. I had a lot of friends who knew me pretty well, and some really close ones that knew me darn well, but not like my wife knows me. There isn't anybody on earth that knows me like my wife knows me. I didn't have that when I was single. I wasn't sure about the future. I mean, who knows who would be with me in 5 years and who wouldn't be? People move, people go different ways. I didn't have a covenant friend. I didn't have somebody who I knew would be with me for as long as we both lived. I didn't have kids or any of the joys that come from the domestic life. There's a lot of great things about the domestic life that I didn't experience any of them. I noticed that in my diet the last 2 weeks when my wife was gone. The food's not nearly as good. But when I was single, I also could do whatever I want. I could date whoever I wanted. I didn't have responsibilities. I didn't feel stressed about hardly anything because I didn't have any responsibility. And so now, in my domestic married life, if I use my memory to think about all the things that were better when I was single, it's very predictable what that's going to do. It's going to poison my mind and my satisfaction towards my married life right now. And it's going to make me wish I had all those benefits that I had then. It's not rocket science. And it's going to make me wish I could have those benefits now. And so I'll either live in my married life like a single guy, which is really dumb looking, or I'll want to get out of my family life. I'll feel resentful towards it. I'll feel like it took away something from me. I'll feel resentful. But you see, if I remember the other set of things, if I remember that I was lonely, if I remember that nobody really knew me like my wife knows me, if I remember that my bed was empty, there was no one there at night. If I remember that I didn't know who would be with me in the future, who would and who wouldn't be. If I remember those things, then I realize that though I gave some things up to be married, and though my intern can stay out till 6:11 if he wants, and I can't, it'll draw me towards my wife and my family and my domestic life. It'll make me thankful. It will remember that the old life had its own bitter herbs and bread of affliction, that I don't want to go back. And what's true about just a simple single and married life is so much more true about our spiritual life with God. I mean, when I think of my life before I was a Christian, yeah, I did sins that I wanted to do, and I didn't feel that bad about them. It's true, and there were certain rules that didn't constrain me, and there was a certain open-mindedness where I didn't have to get in any fights with anybody. I wasn't in a minority group that people looked down on, and there were benefits before I was a Christian, pragmatically at least. And I could sit around as a pastor and think about how, I can't take home anybody I want to, and I'm not free in a lot of ways, and I have to obey Jesus. He's my Lord and Master. And that He's given me a calling. I've got to live it out. I can't just go get a different job if I don't like this one. I believe He's called me to this, and so I've got to do it. And I need to figure out how to be happy in what I'm doing rather than just do whatever I think might make me happy. And those could be considered liabilities, right? But if what I remember is that I really was emotionally lost. If I remember that I didn't understand what my life was for, and so I didn't really have good direction. If I remember how I felt the guilt lift, I felt like I was becoming who I was meant to be. I realized that God was doing something in me from the inside out. I had a sense of mission and purpose in the world. I began to see the wisdom of the Bible, how good and beautiful it was. I began to see it build a kind of nobility and manhood in me that I didn't know how to build any other way. If I remember all of those good things that God has done, then I won't sit around bitter. I won't sit around thinking God was mean to me by becoming my master. I'll remember how good it is to be His son. And if I confess that, and if I remember it, I think that'll have a huge impact on the kind of Christian I am and the kind of Christian we are together. I think we need to be committed to confessing what we're to believe that Jesus teaches us and remembering all the good God has done for us and taught us. And I think we need to recognize that it's an ordinance. He's commanded us to do it. And some of the ways He's commanded us to do it is in rituals, particularly the rituals of baptism and communion. And we need to participate in them and celebrate them to be His church faithfully. And if we do, I think we'll understand the gospel better. I think we'll naturally love God more. I think we'll be more deeply transformed. And I think we'll see benefits everywhere in our life if we'll embrace Jesus' ordinance to the ritual of confession and remembrance.